The Italian right is coming off a major victory as of yesterday's elections, as you can see with the maps in front of us. Now, I won't be doing a full breakdown of this. That will be on this week's episode of the War Report, so keep your eye out for that. But just to give some brief thoughts, what you have on the left is a map of the Chamber of Deputies, which is the lower house of the Italian legislature, and what you have on the right is a map of the Italian Senate, which is the upper house of the legislature, and it's color coded. And as you can see, the right has scored massive victories. And just taking a look at the actual raw numbers just briefly, you can see that they scored an over 50% majority in both houses. Now, that doesn't necessarily line up with the number of votes they actually got, but because of the proportional representation system, it does a lot more seats and there's multiple representative districts. And just to give you a brief comparison before I get into too much of my general thoughts on this, this is the change in the vote share since 2018 with your respective parties. Of course, you have Brothers of Italy, which is the party that won the plurality of the vote and was the head of the right wing coalition. They have scored almost 26% of the vote. League, which is Salvini's party, is down because most of their votes got eaten up by the other members of the right wing coalition. Same with Forza, which is Berlusconi's party, which, if you'll recall, if you have general knowledge about Italian electoral history, Berlusconi is, and it's not saying much, but probably the most successful post war prime minister and has a record of actually having been able to serve a full term without a collapse in government. You have the now disgraced Five Star Movement, who destroyed their own coalition in 2019, and you have the left wing Democratic Party, which stayed about even with what it scored because most of the shifting took place on right wing and anti establishment parties. Of course, there were other parties involved that weren't part of either coalition, as you get, and they are more on the, for lack of a better term, fringes, who either don't side with the coalition because of ideological purity reasons or pragmatic reasons, but it does once again appear that the right is going to be back in power in Italy. Now, how long that is going to last, given the track record of previous governments, likely not long before this collapses into yet another caretaker government in about a year and a half. But with that aside, just another brief overview. This just shows the share in votes that each party scored in each region, and you can see the geographical contestment: Five Star more popular in the South, League more popular in the North, of course, and then Brothers and the Democratic Party had a broad appeal across the country. Now, as for Maloney and the expected new government that is going to assume power in the near future, there have been a lot of takes. Of course, there's the standard left wing liberal regime take that she is a fascist, that the party is the descendant of the Italian fascist movement from the 20s and 30s, etc., 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 and the kind of narrative they always pull. They dig into her past, show she was part of these youth organizations, these right wing youth organizations. But also, on the contrary, there are people more on our side, for lack of a better term, who have some digging, and there's the usual connections that you expect with a lot of these national conservative types. Stuff at the Aspen Institute, Tony Blair, which once again I'll get into more detail about when we do our actual episode, and give you a more thorough breakdown of the national conservative movement and my thoughts on it and its potential for actual change. But like all electoral systems, it is going to be something of a controlled opposition. Now, I'm not saying that as a message to abandon all hope or that it's futile. I do think, frankly, this is a good start, but this should be met with skepticism once this coalition actually does assume power. Because you can go back, and this is true of all politicians, I suppose, and find statements that contradict it. You can find a lot of Maloney's positions, such as NATO, which the Brothers Party and Maloney herself have not flipped on the NATO question. In fact, they stood steadfast about it, even when Salvini and Lega were calling for the easing of sanctions just for pragmatic reasons, and you even had some of that from Forza. But you have that. That's to be expected. It unfortunately is a part of that. How much of that will actually be carried out in government policy? Probably standard fare. But this election wasn't decided for foreign policy reasons. It wasn't decided over the Ukraine issue. There is cause for optimism when it comes to the question of migration. And then when it comes to lockdown and the COVID question, unfortunately, that's a bit of a gray area. I've seen things that go back and forth, but a main part of the right wing coalition's campaign was the getting back to normal, what you see from a lot of right wing coalitions and a lot of right wing parties across the Western world. So, while they may not be true believers, I do believe there's cause for optimism that these restrictions may be overturned, that they may be repealed or at least halted for the time being. I'm not expecting anything great, but what I do have to say about these Italian elections, although had I been in Italy, had I been able to vote in these elections, I would have voted for Lega, I would have voted for Salvini personally, but I can't complain too much with the results, but I understand, have, and respect the skepticism that is coming from many elements on our side. I think it's completely warranted, and only time will tell what the future holds, but I do think there is a brief reason for optimism that a another quote unquote establishment position, such as the last Italian government led by somebody like Draghi, has received a, for lack of a better term, vote of no confidence, but the work is far from over, and you need to approach these things with a healthy amount of caution and skepticism. Don't rest on your laurels. Don't act like this is the victory to end all victories, because there are some dubious things about this coalition that certainly warrant more investigation, that certainly warrant more attention. But for the time being, it's a foot in the door, and much like a lot of the other right wing Europe movements across Europe, whether that be in France, whether that be in Germany, or even debatably in some cases with Hungary and Orban, which I'll have more about on the show this week. You can move the needle ever so slightly. In the case of somebody like Orban, even further. But we'll see how this turns out. It could be another Trump type movement where it's just mass disappointment. But I will cover this more on this week's episode, and I'll see you guys then, and goodbye.